An unknown timeline. Well, it's actually a somewhat known timeline that we know about that I'll explain this video about imperfect cell. In this video, I'm going to go over some really interesting things that are too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. And that is the main origin of where Cell came from, and which timeline to be exact. And that would be taking a look at the Dragon Ball Z Super Android 13. In that movie, we see Trunks with his sword, and alongside with ZR warriors fight 3 androids. But one of the most specific things I want to point out is that in that movie or timeline, Cell doesn't exist. Cell doesn't exist in that timeline because Dr. Gero's supercomputer was making androids 13, 14, and 15 instead of creating Cell. In that movie, you see Trunks defeating Android 14 with his sword, but then breaks his sword on Super Android 13. But one thing to note is that if he was introduced to Android 13 instead of Cell, then he would have never known who Cell was. Meaning Cell would have the upper hand in ambushing Trunks, but we also see Trunks being taken out with his sword. But in other movies, we also see Trunks having an extra sword, even though it was previously broken. And in Hirudegarn, Wrath of the Dragon, there are 2 swords, Tapion's and Tapion's younger brothers, who get stepped on by Hirudegarn. So he must have acquired it in some sort of way as he got in his other ones. Like his alternate self, there are 2 swords, by the way. But besides that, what I'm trying to ascertain is, Cell is from the Trunks future timeline from the Super Android 13 movie.
So after Trunks defeats Android 14 and goes back to his future timeline, and arrives he's strong enough and able to defeat Androids 17 and 18. Also no, he didn't use the shutoff remote, mainly because he doesn't know where Dr. Gero's hidden lab with the blueprints to make that remote is, or that he has one. And key point is that Cell is the one that told Piccolo about the hidden lab, so no, it's impossible for that to happen. Also, Cell lied about Trunks having the remote to use it on the androids. Oh, and also Cell didn't know about the shutoff remote until one was made, because when he first fights Piccolo, he tells Piccolo and somehow Trunks was able to beat the androids, and then later assumed it was the remote. So he is just boasting about his android's power that he was programmed to absorb, which is a conflict of interest and is hard to believe for that matter. Because as we see in the main timeline where Trunks beats Cell, he tells Cell that he defeated the androids, and Cell, no matter what Trunks says, even though he did beat the androids, Cell still can't believe and thinks it's all just derisory. Cell even calls them his babies. But I digress, so anyways, Trunks having no clue who Cell is, and Cell being able to hide his power or suppress it from Trunks, would make Trunks think he wouldn't have to turn into a Super Saiyan to beat Cell. Just like when Trunks fought the Frieza soldiers, like when he fought Inru. And Cell kind of does look like Inru. Trunks could have thought it was just one of Frieza's soldiers gone rogue. But another thing I want to add is that this Cell that beat Trunks might be at his strongest as an imperfect Cell could be, because we also see that when Cell goes back to the past, he has to regress back to his larval state, losing most of his powers in doing so. And Cell is a type of an artificial life form, referred to as a bioandroid, created by Dr. Gero's supercomputer from the cell sample of the universe's strongest warriors, possessing the genetic information of Goku, Vegeta, Piccolo, King Cold, and Frieza in an underground complex beneath Gero's secret laboratory. He's not fully silicone-based like some of the androids, and is somewhat of an artificial carbon-based life form. Also, with assuming Cell being an android, his android part of himself, when he regressed back to his larval state, he would lose even some of his power as he originally had in that state. My guess is this caused Cell as an android, and comparing him to a 32 megabyte SD card. When you format that SD card, erasing everything on it, you don't fully get 32 megabytes of memory on it. After deleting or formatting everything, you lose some kilobytes of storage capacity in the process. My conclusion was that imperfect Cell originally came from the future Trunks timeline that was in the Super Android 13 movie. That's how that movie connects. Isn't that crazy? Also, I conclude that imperfect Cell also seemed to be lurking around that timeline a bit longer than the other imperfect Cell, in search of the androids and absorbing a lot more humans. It's way most likely a little more than the one we see Trunks knows about, and baits him to come out to him. So it would mean that the imperfect Cell, before regressing back and not losing power from regression, and including all the humans, the small population of that dystopian future Cell had absorbed would mean he'd probably be more stronger than the imperfect that had his rematch with Piccolo, and also when he fought Android 16. And also he'd always originally believed he could absorb the androids straight out of the lab, and didn't have to absorb humans for a couple of years to get stronger, to be able to absorb the androids. But that's about it for this video. Thanks again and laters. Before I go, here's a quick comparison of a real animal that reminded me of Cell and how he absorbs people and androids.
Creatures can grab with either end.